Great. Thank you very much, Janet. Thank you, George, for a great talk. How do I follow that? Well, I'll do my best. And thank you to all of you for coming. It's great to see a full house here, and I understand there are people who couldn't get in as well, so it's really wonderful to see that there's so much interest in this subject. I'm going to approach it a little bit differently to George, so I've got slides here, and my presentation is going to be sort of framed by a bit of an international perspective at the beginning and the end, and then focused on Scotland in the middle. So it's Rewilding the World is the title, so I'm going to start with, why do we need to rewild? Well, this photograph is that story for me. I have this picture on my desk in my office. It's been there for 25 years. Beautiful picture, the Earth from space, taken by the Apollo astronauts. This blue and white orb, the only place still known to support life. And one day, many years ago, I looked at that and I saw it through different eyes. For the first time, what really struck me was the most prominent feature there is desert, the brown areas. And although deserts are natural ecosystems in the world, most of what you see there is desertified land, degraded land. And up at the top, you can see North Africa. 2,000 years ago, there were big forests there, full of wildlife like the Barbary lion and the Atlas bear, both of which are now extinct, and the forests are gone. Human civilization, Western civilization, is said to have begun in the Fertile Crescent, up on the top again. Modern-day Iraq, desert. So this, although it's a beautiful picture, is to me a picture of a wounded world, a degraded planet. And it's there because it's the call for help. And this has been used in photos, magazines, films, books. It's always this photograph that's used, and I think it's this silent call for help, this message that's going out. Pay attention. So, just a little bit about that degraded world, which George has referred to as well. This is because my main interest is trees and forests. I've done a bit of research over the years looking at what is the state of the world's forests, and these are just a few I've picked. The Caledonian forest in Scotland, we don't know exactly what it was, but it's probably less than 3% is what we've got left. But if you go through many other forest types around the world, you'll see it's tiny percentages, and you could pick a lot more and put them in there too. And that's what it looks like in some areas. Degraded mangrove forest in Madagascar. So the forests have been drastically reduced, and gone with the forests is the wildlife. If I can get the technology to work here, here we go. So this picture here, a mountain of bison skulls when the American bison was hunted to the verge of extinction, from 30 million down to a low of 1,000. There's now about 50,000 bison again, so it got turned around. Sadly, that didn't happen for the passenger pigeon, the most numerous bird to have lived on this planet ever. And some of you perhaps are aware that last month was the 100th anniversary, if it could be called an anniversary, of the extinction of the passenger pigeon. How could we do that? 5 billion to 0. And tigers are heading in that direction. The woolly spider monkey of Brazil, many others. And the figure that George referred to earlier, 50% or 52% of the world's wildlife, vertebrate species lost in the last 40 years. And the rate of loss is accelerating. On that trajectory, it will be gone in another 40 years, the lifespan of many of us here in this room today. How many people know about these species, the ones that we've lost in the 21st century? The Pyrenean ibex died in the first days of the new millennium, the last one. Most people were still suffering a hangover from parties to celebrate 2000. But I think looking back in the decades and centuries ahead, that will be a more memorable occurrence. That will be what is thought of more. And you can see going through there, these are just the big species we've lost. We don't know all the little ones. Many of them are insects in the tropical rainforest that are wiped out when the area is bulldozed. 150 or more a day is the best estimate scientists have at the moment. So we live in this world that is being impoverished on a daily basis. And what's happened historically in Scotland, through the loss of our forests, the loss of wildlife that George has alluded to, is now being repeated all over the planet on a massive scale. So when I was in southern Venezuela many years ago, I took the photograph on the left. It looked for all the world like the scene on the right, Strathfarrar 2 years ago. One solitary pine skeleton in an otherwise treeless landscape. That's what we've inherited in Scotland from previous generations, and that is increasingly the reality of much of the world that we're going to pass on to future generations. So, in Scotland, much of our landscape is in a highly degraded condition. We've got remnants of what was once here, the skeletons of the trees, the graveyard of the roots of our vanished forest. Like this is Glen Affric, actually, which is known for its beautiful pine woods in the east of the glen, but you go further west, you see very quickly the degradation. The upper Affric River has lost its riparian trees. Peat is getting eroded and washed down the river, and on the right you can see there big lumps of peat on the shingle and the ruins of a croft. People used to live in these glens, many of them forced out during the clearances 200 and 250 years ago. And we in Scotland have suffered the same fate as many indigenous peoples elsewhere through the breaking of the connection between people and the land, again, that George was referring to. There we go. So, two landscapes 2 kilometres apart in Glen Affric. What future do we want? A healthy, vibrant forest, or this remnant, this wounded world with only the dead wood as a reminder of what's been lost? So just to summarise, the Highlands today, which is the area I know best, is in a very depleted condition. We've lost most of our forest. We've lost most of our large wildlife species. Many of them are extirpated completely, the big carnivores and so forth. Other species, from red squirrel to wildcat to wood ants, are grossly depleted in number because their habitat is gone. Crucial ecological processes, succession, disturbance, predation, are absent. And as George said, when you take away those processes, you get ecosystem collapse. A healthy, vibrant ecosystem cascades down to a shadow of itself. And it continues at a very low level of productivity. And we've taken our forests in Scotland, maybe 50, 60 feet high, and we've reduced them to grassland in areas like this that are maybe 1 inch high. And you can imagine the loss of habitat that's taking place there. And then the way we manage the land prevents any recovery of that. We have such a heavy exploitation of it through overgrazing, muir burn, extraction of carcasses that deplete the few nutrients that are left, that the land is unable to recover. Somebody asked me today, why did we want to turn the clock back to how it was in the past? And I said, it's not a question of turning the clock back, it's a question of starting the clock again. The clock of evolution, the clock of dynamic life. It has come to a standstill, and we have these frozen museum piece landscapes in the Highlands at a minimum level of productivity. Sterile. What Sir Frank Fraser-Darling called the wet desert in the 1950s. Wales, the same thing, as you said. Just to give you a couple of examples of this, on the left, peat hags. Many of you are perhaps familiar with them if you walk around in the Highlands. They're open sores, they're running wounds in the landscape. The vegetation's been eroded, the exposed peat is revealed, the stumps of our vanished forest are like the bones in a graveyard. They're unable to recolonize with vegetation. On the right, you see the difference that reducing grazing pressure makes. Heather is a natural seral stage of ecosystems, heather moorland. It would colonize grassland, and in the heather you get pioneer trees growing like the young birch next to the fence there. Eventually they will be succeeded by slower growing trees like pine or oak, and you get this process of development, this change in ecosystems, which is completely absent in Scotland today. Have any of you ever wondered why the most common native tree in the country is birch? Birch woods are our most abundant native woodland. Birch is a pioneer phase of forest, and it's stuck. Our birch woods are derelict. They're not able to develop into oak woods or pine woods or ash or anything else. They're stuck in the pioneer phase. And this stuckness is maintained by excessive numbers of herbivores. Deer are a woodland animal, but they're totally out of balance. Their numbers have more than doubled in the past 35 years. They overgraze any seedlings that get developed, and we're left with this geriatric forest. The old trees dying of old age without any progeny coming to replace them. How bad is the overgrazing? Well, this is a clump of rowan seedlings I've been photographing for over 20 years. Top left, you can see October 1992, what they looked like then. And if you follow the sequence through to June 2012, the last time I was out there, they're actually smaller than they were 20 years previously. Negative growth in 20 years. And if you look, you'll see there's not a single living tree in that landscape. Trees are attempting to grow, but everything is held in check. And there's so little to eat there that even a single deer would find that rowan, and there's no chance for it to recover. That is what we've inherited. This is the museum piece landscape. But it doesn't have to be like that. In 1987, as part of my sort of early stages of work for Trees for Life, I was up in Strathfarrar, and I saw this scene on the left here. Trees growing inside a fence. Nobody planted them. Self-sown progeny from the old pines in the background. What you can't see in the picture is there's lots of birch seedlings there too, but it was winter, so they had no leaves, and you can't see outside the fence lots of pine seedlings still getting eaten where the browsing pressure was too high. 22 years later, and look how dense the trees are there. They've all grown of their own accord. This is natural regeneration. The natural state of much of the Highlands would be forest if we gave it a chance. So that was the starting point for Trees for Life. No prizes for recognizing that character on the left, full of hair. That was in 1992, 2 years after the first project we did with the Forestry Commission, fenced off 50 hectares to keep the deer out. And on the right, photograph taken just a few weeks ago, and you can see the trees are shot away. The first time new trees would be able to grow there for over 20 years, over 200 years. This, I think, is even more dramatic. Though the same area, doesn't show the fence. In the middle of it, when the fence went up, the woodland was dying. 3 or 4 standing dead pines there, and the forest was still receding down the glen. Once the fence went up, all the young seedlings could grow. None of those trees are planted. They've regenerated naturally. And you can see the old snag is virtually unchanged. They persist for a long time. They are the reminders of what once was here. They're the link with the past. And now there's a future for areas like this. Regeneration only works where you've got a seed source. And in many of the areas where we work, there are no trees left to provide regenerating seedlings. So we plant trees. And this is the results we've been getting here. The picture on the top left was our very first planting week in April 1991. That man, I still remember his name, Grant McFarlane, planting the pine he's holding by his planting bag next to a stump of a pine tree. And that landscape is the wet desert. You can see how barren and desolate it looks, how the vegetation is suppressed to a tiny size. But if you look at the following 2 photographs, you can see there that not only have the trees grown, but the heather has grown up around, covering the roots of the tree, and there's blaeberries growing on top of the stump as well. The whole process of succession and development of the ecosystem is underway. And when that gets underway, you see the land come back to life again. This is the same area showing the fence line. And this, to me, is really showing the contrast, what George was talking about. It does not have to be this desolate wasteland. Those pines were planted in 1991. I took this photograph about 3 weeks ago. And you can see not only have the trees grown, but heather is in flower and bog myrtle growing next to the fence there. But outside, it's only grass and the peat hags. Those are 2 more photographs showing the same area. The line of the fence demarcates the difference between what you could almost be described as a wild natural garden. Look at it, beautiful, varied, rich and diverse, supporting wildlife, and outside, desolation. And the peat hags themselves will heal over if they're given a chance. Anybody's been up in any of these glens in the Highlands, if you wander around, you see them, they're everywhere. But if they're protected, sphagnum moss and other plants will grow and eventually colonize them over. You can just about see part of one of the stumps there. That was a peat hag before that area was fenced 20 years previously. And I, for one, as a Scot, I have to say I'm embarrassed and ashamed that so much of our land still looks like the left there, because there's no reason for it. There's no need for it. It does not have to be that way. And as the trees recover, they provide the habitat for wildlife. We get the insects coming back. A green hair streak butterfly in the top left on an eared willow growing inside the area we've just seen. Spontaneous regeneration of the tree, the insects come, and then the birds come, like the crested tit on the right, to feed on them. And the bottom photograph there is a sawfly larva on Dundregan, the land that we own and care for in Glenmoriston. It feeds on dwarf birch, never recorded in the UK before. And the dwarf birch is part of the montane scrub community, which is the top edge of the forest. The trees and shrubs grow to be about waist height, dinner table height for deer. So that fragile environment is demolished. There's very little of it left today. So the wildlife begins to recover. We get the habitat, we get the first stages of wildlife coming in. Then it's important to bring in the bigger species, the functional components that are missing at the moment. So we've had the trial reintroduction of beavers over at Argyll. We've also got the unofficial beaver population in the Tay, which is much bigger. And there's also wild boar. They've escaped from various parts of Scotland. We have them on our Dundregan land, but they're not wild there. They're inside a fence. We're utilising their function for soil disturbance and bracken control. So it's really important that we bring those missing functions and species back into our ecosystems. And whenever we make one of these changes in a positive direction, it ripples throughout the ecosystem. Here, we're protecting an aspen sucker, which is a shoot growing off the roots of a parent aspen tree. And unlike a tree seedling, if you plant a tree seedling, it grows very slowly. These suckers can grow 4 feet, in this case, in 10 weeks, because it's got the whole root system of a big parent tree to support it. It's like a tropical rate of growth. But what was even more remarkable, in those 10 weeks, that sucker started supporting aphids, which in turn were being tended by wood ants that harvest the honeydew that the aphids secrete. So we begin to see the vegetation, when you benefit that, you get these knock-on effects for the wildlife. The same thing with the boar we've got at Dundregan. We brought them in to control bracken and to churn up the soil. You can see the one on the left doing that, rooting around in the ground. There's literally sods flying in that picture there. And that exposed ground creates ideal germination conditions for the seeds of trees like Scots pine. What we also found completely unexpectedly was within a day, literally within 24 hours of the boar arriving, they began to get followed around by robins. And that particular winter, 2009, 2010, was one of those really cold winters. I'm sure you remember it, lots of snow. So the robins got really close to the boar, as you can see. Why is that? Well, the robins are opportunistic, and this is a well-known phenomenon in continental Europe where boar have never been exterminated. Robins follow them around and look for disturbed ground and find grubs and worms and so forth. In Britain, in Scotland, in the absence of boar, robins have adapted and humans have become the surrogates for them. So anybody who's a gardener will know if you dig your garden, the robins come and look for worms. So they've adapted to use humans instead of boar. But they have a memory, and within 24 hours of the boar being back on the land, the robins were there with them. So you begin to get these relationships and interactions happening. As soon as you put something back in place in the ecosystem, there's a ripple effect of beneficial things for others. So the next step then is the return of the predators. We don't have any big terrestrial predators in Scotland at the moment. We've brought back a couple of birds of prey, the sea eagle and the red kite. Ospreys have returned of their own accord. Our biggest terrestrial predator, the Scottish wildcat, is highly endangered, and who knows what its future is going to hold. But we're totally missing the big species, the top predators, which have this controlling influence that George so articulately described a little bit earlier. And when they're removed, we get this ecosystem collapse. So the next step is we need to bring them back. And in continental Europe, these species, the wolf, the lynx, and even the bear, are spreading of their own accord. But they cannot spread to Britain, they cannot spread to Scotland because we're an island. So we need to reintroduce them. So I'm moving quickly here. Just to summarize then, out of the work that we've done, we've developed a set of principles of rewilding, principles of ecological restoration that guide our work. And these are general principles that can be applied to any ecosystem in the tropics or to the seabed or the oceans, as George was describing earlier. You work from areas of strength where the ecosystem is closest to its natural condition. You pay attention to the keystone species, the beavers, the wolves, the lynx, and so forth, the Scots pine, the keystone species in the vegetation community. You re-establish ecological processes the pioneer species and the natural succession that I've described earlier. You mimic nature wherever possible. You recreate niches where they've been lost, like this one here for the aphids feeding on the aspen sucker. And you re-establish the ecological linkages. You reconnect the threads in the web of life. You control or remove introduced non-native species. You remove or mitigate the limiting factors which prevent rewilding from occurring naturally, because it should occur of its own accord. 10,000 years ago, Scotland had no trees because they'd been covered by ice for 90,000 years. And when the ice retreated, there were no Trees for Life volunteers to plant then. The trees came back by their own accord. They would do so now if we weren't preventing them by having too many herbivores. So let's reduce our herbivore numbers. You reintroduce species that are unlikely or impossible to return by themselves, like the lynx or the wolf. You re-establish those ecological processes, predation, natural disturbance. You let nature do most of the work. And the green thumb principle, the human involvement, when we work with the care and love of our hearts, we can accelerate and strengthen that natural recovery process. So I just want to say a little bit about that then, the transformative effects of working with rewilding, because George touched on that from a different angle about what we're missing in our lives. And I, for one, have been saying for a number of years, I grew up deprived of one of my intrinsic birthrights, daily contact with wild nature. Nature out with human control. And that's really getting to a lot of what rewilding is about. It's about letting nature be in charge again and letting nature take her own course. So one definition of ecological restoration is helping to reconnect the strands in the web of life. Rewilding could apply to as well. Although it's usually applied to ecosystems, it applies equally to people and our relationship with the rest of nature, because we have become disconnected. So engaging in rewilding has a profound effect on people. It is the work which reconnects people and nature. And these are just a few of the things that I think are important that I've observed in myself and in all the thousands of volunteers who come to help organizations like Trees for Life. Connects us with the rest of nature, connects us with place. You have to know a place to rewild it. It's not an abstract, impersonal thing. It involves deep ecological knowledge of a site. It reconnects people with life at a time when so much of our media and culture is focused on death and destruction. Connects us with each other. Connects people with their own power to make a positive difference in the world. What could be more meaningful than planting a tree that will be there for 250 years, that will support birds and insects, squirrels, and all sorts of other life? Connects us with healing. We're healing the land, and we undergo a process of healing ourselves. With hope, what George spoke about. It is a work of hope. I will never see the fruits of our labors. My grandchildren might see the benefits of it. And with spirit. Spirit in ourselves, the shared spirit with each other, and the spirit of nature. So rewilding, engaging in rewilding, provides the opportunity for each of us to make a positive contribution to making the world a better place, to passing on a more vibrant and healthy planet to future generations, providing a home for our 5 to 100 million fellow passengers on the world, the other species that we live with. We don't even know how many there are. We do know that number is shrinking every year. So we can draw inspiration from our connection with nature. And rewilding is a labor of love. It's not something that will derive immediate economic gain, because if you look at it in more economic language, the natural wealth of the land has been depleted. We need to put something back without expecting any return for maybe decades. And rewilding is having an impact in Scotland. What I've observed over the years since I started this in the 1980s is other organizations, and there's representatives from some of them here tonight, like the John Muir Trust, have also come into being, caring for the land, offering a different vision for the future. People have gone out climbing the Munros, they've gone out mountain biking, connecting with the land and seeing the state of Scotland today and realizing we need to do something about it. And that has been paralleled by this wave, this crescendo of desire for greater control over our own lives that has led to the establishment of the Scottish Parliament. And now, after the vote last month, we're going to get more powers devolved to Scotland. We're going to claim more ability to determine our own future. And those two things are interlinked because native peoples everywhere know that the health of society depends on the connection with the land and the well-being of the land. And we're rediscovering that in Scotland. Professor Stephen, one of the authors of the classic book about the native pine woods, is famously quoted as saying, "To stand amongst the ancient pines is to feel the past." Planting a pine is giving birth to the ancient forests of the future. Those of us alive today are privileged in the sense that we can see the old granny pines of the Caledonian forest, those veterans that are 250 years old. In 50 years' time, within the lives of many of the audience here, those trees will all be gone. There will be no more granny pines in Scotland for a further 200 years because of the generation gap that's already there. The young trees of today will be 50 years old, but they will not have the character of the ancient forests of today. So all we can do is offer the gift to the future. So, just going to the end, I'd like to issue a call to the Scottish Government. And George and I were at a meeting at the Scottish Parliament today with some of the members of the Scottish Parliament in their, one of their groups. And I call on the government to take positive steps to further rewilding in Scotland. There is a momentum demonstrated by the interest in this event. The media coverage has been generated today as well. So we've got a number of opportunities ahead of us. There's a new round of Scottish Rural Development Programme grant funding going to be announced next year. So I would like to see that include enhanced measures for native forest restoration along stronger ecological principles than has been in the past. Next year, the government's going to announce the results of the beaver trial and make a decision on the future. So to me, it's very clear we should be having beavers back. There's proven benefits for it. Let's have a wider scale reintroduction. Let's also be more ambitious and look at the first of our predators to come back, the Eurasian lynx, a simpler and easier animal to reintroduce than the wolf. Let's see if we can do that in the next 10 years. And then let's also support rewilding in other countries, because we've seen at the beginning of this the need for it. And in Scotland, we're privileged. We're one of the wealthiest countries in the world. We've got intelligent, well-educated people. We've got the ability to make a difference. Let's support that happening elsewhere where perhaps people don't have the opportunity themselves. And just finally then, just to say there are rewilding projects happening spontaneously, usually by local people on a small scale all over the world. This is one in India I visited a couple of times. The tree on the left, one of the most endangered in the world. It's part of what used to be called the tropical dry evergreen forest. Almost completely vanished. But people are starting to plant those and restore them now in conditions that are very much harder to deal with in Scotland. Costa Rica, where most of the dry tropical forest has been burned to create cattle pasture for the so-called hamburger connection, to get cheap hamburgers for burger chains like McDonald's. This man, studying them, Dan Jansen, a famous American scientist, realized that if he didn't do something, he'd have nothing to study because it was almost all gone. 2% left, if you remember my chart earlier. So he's got a control patch on the left there, which he still burns every year, which is what's done. And behind him on the right, no burning, and the forest is recovering by itself. If you're wondering why it's leafless, it's a dry forest in the dry season. So the trees have shed their leaves. And on the right, from Hong Kong, which is not all buildings, there are green hills in Hong Kong, or brown hills as they are now, but people are working to restore those too. So the need for restoration and rewilding is global. That picture of the Earth from space is our call. And I've been carrying the vision, the dream for a number of years that the healing of our world, the rewilding of our world, will become the first shared task for all humanity. We've never had a goal that unites all nations, all peoples, all cultures before. The time is right for it, and surely it has to be taking care of the one thing we have in common, our home, the earth. And the great thing about it is we can each make a contribution to that. We can each rediscover our deep, profound connection with nature, our sense of wonder, and our personal empowerment that our life matters, our cares matter, and that we can pass on a healthier, more vibrant, more abundant world to future generations that will be a home for all the remarkable wildlife. I just want to finish with one other thought. Some of you probably are very well aware that there's 2 probes have recently been put into orbit around Mars, one from the US and one from India. And you know, there's great sort of celebrations, particularly about the Indian one. It's a tremendous achievement. And they are part of an ongoing effort to look for life on Mars. And at the moment, you know, we don't know if there's ever been life on Mars. I suspect there has. And if those probes and successive ones are successful and find even a single microbe, it's going to be a tremendous sense of joy and celebration. We're not alone in the world. But why is it that we spend so much money and effort and so much focus of human endeavor to the possibility that we might find a microbe on Mars when we have such remarkable diversity of life on our planet, and we're letting it all slip through our fingers? We're losing it. Surely we can find it in ourselves to turn things around, to make a difference. We have the power. We have the ability to do that. It's just a question of rising to the challenge, and that's the challenge I will leave you with tonight. Thank you. Forest.